Hello and welcome. My name is Chris Martin, and I am the Interim Executive Director of Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. And on behalf of my collaborators at the Arctic Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's important discussion devoted to Russia-U.S. relations in 2025. Can Arctic science diplomacy mend strategic fences? Today's panel, as you're all aware because you're sitting here, is coming at a crucial moment. The U.S.-Russia relationship is the worst that it's been since before the collapse of the USSR. In fact, since Russia's full-fledged invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there has been basically no relationship to speak of, and what little interaction there has been negative. There have been many impacts of Russia's war against Ukraine outside of the battlefield, and one of them has clearly been U.S.-Russia cooperation in and around the Arctic, which ceased in 2022. So we're currently at a crossroads. On one side, we have the increasingly dire outlook around melting sea ice and rising sea levels in the Arctic. And on the other hand, we have the cessation of scientific cooperation between Russia and many other Arctic states, but most particularly for today's conversation, the U.S. But just as the threat of nuclear war brought the U.S. and Soviet leadership together in the 1980s, might the Arctic be the very topic around which the U.S. and Russia might be able or willing to build dialogue? So with that question in mind, I'm going to pass the floor to Dr. Jennifer Spence, who's the director of the Arctic Initiative, for additional introductions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Chris. And look at this. I love it. It's the last week of classes and we have a full room. So we know we've hit a nerve here. So thank you so much for coming and joining us. I'm going to do a few sort of housekeeping things and then we'll turn it to the very important conversation. First, I want to start our conversation today with a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that the Harvard Kennedy School stands on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Massachusetts people, the original stewards of the region we now know as Boston and Cambridge. We honor their enduring connection to this land and recognize the contributions of Indigenous peoples past and present to the cultural and intellectual fabric of our community. And so this is also an incredibly important part of the Arctic community, and we think it's really important to begin in this way. I want to mention that this is a hybrid event. I think we can expect we have over 200 people registered with us online. So this event is being recorded, and we do have people who hopefully can hear us clearly, but it's going to require, when we get to the Q&A, some nice, clear questions or comments, because there's mics in the ceiling that will pick up your voices, and we're going to rely on you to speak in a way that they can hear us. So the flow of today is going to be, I'm going to hand the floor to our panelists to say some opening remarks. We have a few people online that we know are here with us today that we're also going to invite to say a brief few comments, and then we're going to open it up for conversation with you. I will point out that there are some incredibly knowledgeable people in our audience as well, and we hope that they will join the conversation and so bring their perspectives to the table. So with that, I would like to introduce very briefly, there's bios on the website, so I'm going to spare you the full bios, but these are incredibly knowledgeable and experienced experts that I would like to introduce. Margaret Williams, and she's a senior fellow with us at the Arctic Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School. Beside her, we have Masha Vorontsova, who's a PhD and a longtime marine conservation professional who's been highly regarded in the nonprofit sector for decades. And Marisol Maddox, who is with the Dartmouth College and the Woodrow Wilson Center, and apparently my W's are coming to haunt me today. So with that, I'm going to invite them each to say some brief opening remarks, and then we will get the conversation started. So first, Margaret.
Okay, thank you. Good on the mic? Okay, great. Well, thank you also to the Davis Center for co-hosting this event, and as Dr. Martin from the Davis Center started by saying, when the war in Ukraine, when Russia launched its war in Ukraine, so many things came to a halt, including science and conservation. And I want to address this issue of disrupted science and conservation. But first, before I even go into that and the losses that represent, It's important to note that the war in Ukraine has devastated Ukrainian natural heritage. Of course, Ukrainian people have suffered so deeply, and Ukrainian natural areas and the environment have suffered terribly as well. So that's important to just put on the table as the very critical point. But and it's understandable when we think of the West's reaction to the war in Ukraine that our federal agencies would stop collaborating with Russian science. But keeping that in mind, there is just such a major conundrum, because this disruption in collaboration is happening at a time when the Arctic is changing so rapidly. And Chris did mention a couple of changes. For example, the Arctic region is warming 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the world. The loss of the temperature gradient between the cold Arctic and the hot equator is causing essentially a wavy jet stream. It's disrupting weather patterns. Permanent sea ice is vanishing from the top of the world. The frozen layer of soil that covers much of the northern hemisphere, the permafrost, is also thawing. And beneath in that frozen layer is a high volume of carbon and methane. We need to keep that in the ground. Greenland's ice sheets are releasing fresh water into the ocean, contributing to global sea level rise. So, and this change is going to impact every coastal nation. These are critical problems, and Russia is key to solving them. Russia occupies half of the Arctic coastline. More than half of the northern hemisphere's permafrost occurs in the Russian Arctic. Russia is also home to tremendous biological diversity. And surprising to many, Russia encompasses the world's largest system of protected wilderness areas. So Russia has tremendous biodiversity and so much to protect. Russia also has tremendous cultural diversity. And I want to come back to one place where all of this comes together. In the last month, we have seen 2 major international meetings of important conventions that serve the environment. One, the Convention on Climate Change, the so-called Climate COP, and the other was the Biodiversity COP, which got much less attention. Both of we're in the final week of school. People are thinking about grades. From what I understand, it sounds like both of these COPs would get about a C-. We are failing as a global community to do what we need to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to stem the loss of the very fabric of the life support systems, biodiversity that protects us and brings us so much life and food and health, and is a key to our survival. So Russia is going to be key to solving all of these problems. And my greatest concern is, as this rift between Russia and the West gets deeper, conducting transboundary efforts to solve these problems will be getting more difficult. These challenges are coming together really at one place between the U.S. and Russia, and that's the Bering Sea, a place where we share tremendous cultural heritage, where people have been living for thousands of years, where fish stocks are shared, where wildlife migrates back and forth. They don't pay attention to the boundaries, they don't pay attention to the war, and we need to think about how can we how can we move ahead at this very, very difficult time? Not giving any credence to what Russia is doing in Ukraine, but finding ways to think of the long-term future and our own survival, essentially. So with a little bit of dramatic ending maybe, but I do think this is a critical issue.
Masha, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for this, and thank you very much for Harvard for hosting this wonderful workshop which we have, and this panel, because I really believe that this topic is extremely important, how we can still cooperate. And of course, I will be mostly trying to present Russia, despite of the fact that I'm living in the United States already for 10 years and dual citizenship, so I'm not completely relying to Russia. But I can tell you that when the war started, first half of the year, I was not able to breathe. And then I started thinking, what should be done? How we can start cooperating, and how not to completely build a new Iron Curtain, because definitely, speaking of science, speaking of civil society, there should be cooperation. We should think of track 2, right? The when cooperation is not possible at the level of the government, when there is no dialogues between the diplomats, when it was completely impossible to reach any agreements, we should think about our contacts among civil society, among scientists, and try to build on these contacts. And we can't tell, and we see now that there is cooperation between scientists sometimes is blocked. From both sides, from American and from Russian sides, because if you're speaking of the Russian scientists who are inside the country, some of them are blacklisted because there was around 5,000 Russian scientists. At the first months of the war, they signed the letter against the war, and they are now officially blacklisted. And my friend, for example, who is a professor of Moscow University, he was told that he is on the blacklist. It's not official, but it exists. But he told that in the Moscow University, at the biological department, which is my alma mater, 50% of the people are in this blacklist because they officially signed against the war. What does it mean? That means that every second, every minute, they say something wrong, they can be taken, they can be arrested, they can put in prison. Because this regime is currently building the fear. So people are feared to openly speak, and the way it works out. I've spent 4 months this summer in Russia because I wanted to feel it with my skin, what is happening, and wanted to talk to people. I didn't want to look at the statistics, because when you look at the statistics and pool result, they're telling you 80% is for the war in Russian population. My personal feeling, I can't prove it, but I was there, and majority of people are against the war. They simply are in fear. They don't know how to act. And so what is happening now, they're building their own bubbles in which they can function comfortable. It might be just on the personal life, parents with kids, good school, competition for the private school this spring in Moscow was 30 kids for one place, because there is no propaganda there. There is no so-called уроки о главном, lessons of the main things, meaning propaganda on the war. So families are building these bubbles. Scientists are building the bubbles. I had been to several institutions, and it was like at the 1980s when everybody are actively working, because that was the small corner of freedom to be in your lab, in your institution and work. So it was really, it was fantastic, because you come there, you see that labs are filled with people, they're working, they're writing articles, they communicate, speaking on conferences, and particularly inside Russia. That is going on and on and on, like Marisol conference 2 weeks ago, that is marine education and science. On Arctic, also a lot of conference. This year is 300th anniversary of Russian Academy of Science. Russian Academy of Science was established by Peter the Great, 1724. It was 18 scientists in the whole Russian Empire at this time. Now it's a little bit less than 1 million, of course, with the brain drain. There's another subject, because we have a lot of Russians who have a dual citizens like me, and who are based in the United States or Europe, and they're working. And if we're speaking of collaboration, my suggestion is look to the scientists inside Russia whom you trust, pick them up, work with them, exchange emails, make Zooms, invite them to participate in Zooms, invite them also out of Russia, try to get them to the conferences, because like we were discussing, biennial marine mammal conference of United States Marine Mammal Society was just a month ago in Perth, Australia. And there were 4 Russian scientists there, including Vladimir, who is back. He's from Seattle now. But there were a couple of scientists who came directly from Moscow. Can you imagine what it is nowadays to travel when there is no airplane connection, but there is a desire to go? And they spend their own money to get to this conference. And also, in order not to be affiliated with any institution, they were going on vacations. So they were just going to this conference because they need this information. And that is going on, so people try to get this. There is a lot of good scientists who are here who still keep the connections, I mean from Russia, who still keep the connection, and who manage to go in the summertime for the expedition, and just still are safe. So it's another way just to cooperate. because otherwise we are losing this. We're completing this iron wall, new wall, iron curtain, because my perspective, we should make holes. We should cooperate because it's very important. For example, I'm working on several conventions in the United Nations. And when you see the Russian delegation, BBNJ convention, what is the Russian delegation? They completely are against this. They're represented by the fishery, and Russia now has a doctrine that the food security is the priority of the country. So we have the right to go anywhere with our shipping, fishing vessels and extract the fish. So they don't want this kind of international cooperation. And I'm probably doing too long, right? One thing is I would like to mention that Putin and his government, they changed the constitution. And due to the new constitution, the Russian law and legislation is priority on top of the international. So basically for Russia, all this international convention, despite of they ratified, they're part of this, means less than their own legislation inside. And that is extremely dangerous situation. And Russia is putting this ahead. And basically the Russian government, the current government, is illegitimate because they were elected based on this changed constitution. And the changes in the constitution, nearly 200 of them was, if you look legally, that is not something which is acceptable by lawyers, as they tell. And Khodorkovsky, for example, and his team, they hired now a number of lawyers who are looking at the constitution and changes on constitution and figure out how legal ways just to get rid of these changes in order just to move forward when it will be necessary, right? And then the free election. So it will be not, the country will not be again hijacked by the people who are who do not represent the country. And that's currently what we have. So again, I think that current situation is like this. You have to take in consideration that track one with Russia, with the current government, is probably impossible, but people-to-people diplomacy, science diplomacy is absolutely possible. And as we know, science doesn't have the borders. It's very important to have this information. And I would like just to let you know that Russia continued to work in Arctic, and that is on different. So it's Academy of Science have several projects there. And then there is a lot of going on the Rosatom, which is monitoring the northern path. So they put scientists on board their ships. So there is a lot of observation on marine mammals and others. And secondly, all oil companies, they also put now scientists on their expedition on board, so that when they investigate parts of the ocean, there is always some observation. And that might be an interesting information. It's already available, and probably it might be lacked, this information in the West. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Masha. And Marisol, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. And thank you to Harvard for the invitation. Thank you, Jen and Margaret, for all your work. Okay, so first, it is really important to forefront one of the initial points that Margaret made, which is essentially that in no way can we be granting any geopolitical concessions to Putin. That's very important. And unfortunately, the reality of this situation, if you really take a comprehensive analysis of the threats that are affecting our security as well as basic stability, the threat environment has transformed. And so a lot of my work is kind of looking at this emerging role of what I call actorless threats, things like climate change, biodiversity loss. I actually think the best framework for understanding the nature of the systemic threats that we're facing is well encompassed by the planetary boundaries framework. If you're not familiar with that, I really recommend you take a look at it, because it's not just about climate change, it's about that framework that has identified 9 planetary boundaries that make the Earth habitable for people, where you can have a future that you look forward to and be a healthy person and have a healthy family. And 6 of those things are beyond the threshold of what is safe. Only one of those is climate change. So we're really dealing with an extraordinary level of environmental change, and what we do not have now that, previously, people had more of is time, right? And so that's the major constraint that we're working with in terms of kind of the natural process of, state tensions flaring up and then having the process of reconciliation. So, knowing that is the reality we're dealing with. At the same time, we are dealing with nuclear threats. We are dealing with the flaring up of basically every theater around the globe right now. And so that is the reality of what we're dealing with. So how do we not lose track of momentum of action to address the larger threat environment while still standing firm to aggressive state action? And there's ways in which these intersect. So it is complex, but for this topic of specifically looking at Arctic change and transboundary changes that require transboundary monitoring and modeling and cooperation, we really need to be looking at what is possible below the level of political action. What are those efforts that we can be, that are still existing, that include Russia, that we can build upon in appropriate ways, and really trying to maintain those on-ramps for a time when it is politically feasible to be engaging. We've seen that if you lose a cooperative mechanism, if you kick Russia out of something or Russia fully leaves a body, it's much harder to then build back that basic cooperative mechanism, as opposed to something like the Arctic Council, which I think has really masterfully handled the situation with Russia in the Arctic. That's why the Arctic Council, which is the premier intergovernmental forum for regional cooperation in the Arctic. It's among the 8 Arctic states. Very essentially, it includes indigenous peoples as permanent participants, and it's the only body I know of where indigenous peoples actually have full consultative rights and a seat at the table, which is really important for the merging of traditional indigenous knowledge with Western science, or however you want to call it, just so that we have more comprehensive data sets and a better understanding of baselines for evaluating the changes that we're seeing and knowing, what progress looks like that could actually lead to healthier human societies. And so with the Arctic Council, there was the pause after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and the Norwegians were able to get the chairship from Russia, which was a natural transfer after the 2-year period. So we saw from that there is an understanding by the Russian government that they benefit from this cooperation, and that we want to try to find a path forward. But it has been very limited, for the explicit reason of showing Russia that you will incur costs if you violently invade a peaceful neighbor. You can't do that. And you have interests, and you are working against your own interests when you do something like that. And Russia has, pretty extensive exposure to climate hazards as well, and really needs this cooperation, but we all need this cooperation. So that's where the Arctic Council is trying to kind of find a way to work, to maintain some level of cooperation and to try to build upon that in ways that do not give concessions. There's some other existing cooperative mechanisms that I think could be built upon a bit more. For instance, the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement is the precautionary principle in action. It was an effort that engaged the major fishing countries of the world, looking at the high seas portion of the Arctic Ocean which has been covered in ice and was not a place where people would fish, but recognizing that fish are moving towards the polar regions, we want to prevent a tragedy of the commons situation where you get, you have an unregulated fishery that may be emerging and you have, some fishing activity. So let's create this agreement that puts a moratorium on any fishing for 16 years while research can be conducted cooperatively. And so Russia is a part of that, the United States is a part of that, and numerous other major fishing countries and entities like the European Union. So, that is showing that even following 2022, we do have these places where we are still working with Russia because it's in all of our mutual interest to be doing so. There's also efforts through the Arctic Coast Guard Forum to be facilitating cooperation among the Coast Guards or the Coast Guard equivalents of all the Arctic states because of the very real challenges to search and rescue in the Arctic region, or responding if there's some type of oil spill or any type of incident. And in 2021, the United States and Russia, so our Coast Guard and their border guard, signed an agreement, this joint contingency plan on the Bering and Chukchi Sea on this pollution response mechanism. And so that was something we were supposed to be exercising, having an in-water exercise, and that unfortunately was not able to occur because it wasn't deemed appropriate, which, it makes sense, but, we have to be looking at the relationships and making sure that we do not have any type of degraded ability to respond if there's an incident. But most importantly, it's really about preventing anything from happening in the first place, because pretty much even the best case scenario of cooperation would result in very serious environmental degradation and, very long lasting. And so I think also, one example of where, even from a very self-interested perspective from the United States, thinking about Alaska, we had 10 billion snow crabs that died from a marine heat wave over a couple years. And the reason that our scientists were able to determine that those crabs had died and that they hadn't just migrated from the warming water was because they got the data from Russia. So this was right before Russia's full-scale invasion. So from that determination, that information goes to the fishing industry. And this is really important for American economic interests. If we're telling fishermen or fisher people, this is the gear that you really should be investing in because this is the fishery that is likely to be profitable for you, they need that information about, this is actually something that is probably not going to be coming back in a way where you'll have a significant fishery, so you probably shouldn't make that investment. So from just an economic security perspective, how do we have continued prosperity amidst a time where we're going to be having disruption? So we need the best data as possible to inform that. And so just the last thing I'll say is, there's specific areas where I think we really need to be looking at, how do we promote cooperation that is also respecting the safety concerns of our Russian colleagues in Russia because of the constraints that they're also dealing with from the Putin regime. But things like fisheries, permafrost monitoring, biosecurity, and pandemic prevention, radioactivity, and the whole kind of nuclear legacy of waste. These are areas where it's really in our interest to be working together. So we should be looking at what those opportunities are.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think there's a huge amount to work with there. We're going to add a few additional brief comments. We have 2 people online that we would like to give an opportunity to briefly comment as well. So I'm going to work with my colleague here, Liz, who's going to work magic to have us we're going to start with Pavel Devyatkin, who is from the Institute of the Arctic, who's actually currently an American working on his PhD in Russia, and he has a few additional comments to share with us. Pavel, are you there?
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. That's great. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Great to see you all. Thank you very much for your presentations. Yeah, I'd like to share a few comments based on my experiences here in Moscow working on these issues. I'm often invited to present the American perspective while I'm here in Russia at conferences and seminars. And I find that Russians are still very interested in Arctic cooperation. Especially social scientists are very receptive of the notion of Arctic exceptionalism. And they remember that the notion is largely rooted in Russian political practice since it emerged from the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's call for an Arctic zone of peace. There's still rhetorical openness to cooperation with American and other Western Arctic scientists. American and Western researchers are still invited to Arctic conferences in Russia. There are no visa restrictions. I actually would have been very happy to join you at this event in Harvard, but I couldn't come this time because I'm myself working on getting a Russian visa right now while here in Moscow. So there have been statements from Russian officials regarding suspending payments to the Arctic Council, and there's the revision of the Arctic strategy that removed mentions of the Arctic Council, but not completely, not from the whole strategy. But there is no sweeping ban on cooperation from the side of the Kremlin. So I totally agree with my colleagues that it's important to continue to look for opportunities for cooperation, maintain channels of communication. I agree with what Masha mentioned about holding on to small bubbles and how important it is to still work with Russian scientists and continue to invite Russians to participate in conferences and projects, especially because there's a whole generation of young Russian scientists who are interested in Arctic cooperation, people who are studying in universities right now, who are fascinated by the romanticism of the Arctic, people who are hoping to participate in international expeditions and joint research, whereas perhaps the foreign policy establishment, the established community, is very interested in working with China and India and BRICS countries. Young researchers are still completely interested in working with Americans, with Norwegians, Canadians, and other Arctic researchers. I think researchers here agree that the benefits of cooperation and stability are much greater than those of conflict or confrontation. So I wondered if, like a question for the presenters, if Norway's relationship with Russia can serve as an example for dealing with Russia under the current political circumstances. As Marisol mentioned, there is limited cooperation since Norway took on the chairship, but there is some gradual resumption of cooperation. And we're seeing how Norway has imposed sanctions against Russia, signed a bilateral defense agreement with the U.S., hosted NATO troops in the largest military exercise since the Cold War. But at the same time, Norway is continuing to collaborate with Russia to manage fisheries in the Barents Sea, to manage the Norwegian-Russian border, and to some extent, Coast Guard rescue operations. And of course, that the management of fisheries especially involves state-affiliated scientists. So these developments show that while relations may have been mostly severed, there are still some narrow openings for cooperation around issues that are seen as essential. And I wonder if this kind of perspective can also apply to Arctic science, as we're seeing how the climate emergency is an existential threat. And in the US, we're looking at climate change as a national security threat. So cooperation with Russia to understand what's happening in the Arctic, the changing environment, ends up being a sort of security concern on its own. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to hear. I'm happy to hear what you all think of.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pavel. So I'm going to, Margaret saying she's going to take a crack at your question here. So Margaret, I'll hand the floor to you. You've got it. You got your.
Forgot. I have my own microphone. Hi, Pavel. Thank you for the question. And I think I'll answer just part of it. And when you referenced cooperation between Norway and Russia, that is primarily in the around fisheries in the Barents Sea. And those two countries share some really important economic resources, cod stocks and other fish stocks. And so that has, for decades, Norway and Russia have been collaborating And we heard yesterday from some Norwegian colleagues, they refer to this system as machinery. There's a very elaborate machinery of collaboration that has occurred over years, and it was very entrenched and very successful and effective. And these stocks decades ago were recognized by the U.S. and Russia as by the Norway and Russia as a shared joint stock. So that gave both countries a feeling of co-ownership. And I think that's one of the great incentives for these countries for the two countries to still be working together and managing that resource. We actually have a very similar situation between Alaska and Russia in the Bering Sea. We share a massive pollock stock that is moving across the boundary, and there have been mechanisms for joint fisheries management and joint enforcement of the maritime boundary, but those machineries pieces were not so much entrenched, and so that those communications have really degraded and pretty much stopped, except for the enforcement monitoring. There is, Marisol mentioned the existence of the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. That's a multilateral agreement, and that is a place where scientists from the states, fisheries scientists are meeting Russian scientists. So it's a multilateral forum, but it is a very important one where those people can meet and exchange information.
Anything either Masha or Marisol you want to add?
I'll just add one brief thing. It is my impression that there is still some cooperation with some of the RFMOs, the regional fishery management organizations, including in the North Pacific. But to Margaret's point about the Bering Sea, and to your point, Pablo, about the Norwegian-Russian cooperation in the Barents Sea, where they have the data exchange and create the quota that is agreed upon for the fish. So you have to have really sustainable management of the fish. In the Bering Sea, we are having these extraordinary environmental changes and just this real ecological upheaval. And so it's in both of our interests to be collaborating on that data so that we can have a robust fishery for years to come, right? If we can pillage the seas and then everybody's going to eat really well for a while, and then you can look at your child and be like, sorry. The Bering Strait, it's also noteworthy to say that it is a strategic choke point from a military perspective, but at the same time, it's also a marine superhighway. And there's changes in migration patterns, there's changes in predator-prey dynamics, emergence of new pathogens or new challenges like harmful algae blooms, which had previously been dormant in the cold waters, and as it's warming, they're emerging and causing really serious food security and economic security issues. So all of this is to say, yes, I really think that makes sense to be looking at what are the ways to be facilitating collaborative data sharing across that region, just because it makes sense if you're sane.
And Masha's going to add the final word on this.
Just really a final word, a little bit about Russian-Norwegian situation right now. And because I was working on the harp sales, and that is part of the fish. So agreement, a part of the fish agreement. So quotas for the seal hunt was established by joint Russian-Norwegian Commission. Right now, it still works, but the scientific committee, ICES, is kind of suspended. So the quotas are established by Russia by themselves and Norwegians themselves. Previously, it was 50-50. On seals, it was 75% for Russia, less for Norway. But current situation is like this, that when the war started, we start hearing from the governor of Archangel district that he would like to return to the seal hunt, which was forbidden in 2009. And basically now, when there is no international agreement stopped working, that is like a loophole from where he can act. And there was a lot of publication in the newspaper that he's pushing for this to happen, which hopefully will not. It's a commercial hunt, not indigenous.
So an interesting case, but a fragile case, and one that can, we need to focus on how to to create resilient mechanisms for this type of thing. I'm going to now, we have another person online that we wanted to give the floor to. Don Anderson is from Woods Hole, the Oceanographic Institute, and I'm going to give him a few moments to also say a few words.
Great. Well, thank you. And actually, a very good segue to what I'm going to talk about. Just a quick introduction. I'm a scientist and working on a problem that was mentioned earlier that we call harmful algal blooms. Many of you probably think of them as a more common term, red tides. They occur in many different forms all over the world, but there's in particular, there's one we've studied for a long time in the North Atlantic, which we now find is moving up and invading into the Alaskan Arctic, into the Pacific Arctic. And as we just heard, this is an example of that biological superhighway that you just heard mentioned, where what we've found is that this organism, which was previously basically unreported in waters north of the Bering Strait, or almost unreported, very rarely seen up there, is now, we've seen it every year in the last 6 or 7 years. And the blooms, as we call them, are enormous. And not only that, we are seeing that they are originating in the western part of the Bering Sea, over what we call the Gulf of Anadyr. But we can't sample there. We can't work there. All of our maps and all of our surveys have a line drawn right through them as you go through the territorial line right through Bering Strait and the Bering Sea. So imagine if you're trying to forecast the weather or understand the weather, and you can only get radar from half of the U.S. or half of the region you're trying to forecast for. That's what we struggle with. And we were able to get some funding through the U.S. National Park Service to well, the program is called the Beringia Shared Heritage Program. If you think of Beringia as that land bridge connecting Asia to North America, there's a lot of common interest there in science, and these red tides or toxic algae were certainly one of them. So we were giving funding to work with colleagues in Russia so we could not have this line right through our data sets where we didn't know what was happening to the West. And we started off with plans for training for people to come, to share samples, to share methods, and then it was completely shut down by the conflict. And just so you understand what the problem, it's not just me as a scientist saying this is a shame, science is moving more slowly and much more, it's a much more incomplete situation than we wish. But this is a very dangerous situation for people up there, because these are toxins that kill people and make people very sick. And in the rest of the world, just about, we worry mostly about the toxins in clams or maybe crabs. But in that part of the world where everyone is a subsistence harvester, when you're in these remote communities, everything they eat, they have collected or hunted. And imagine if virtually everything that you collect that way could be toxic, and you have no easy way up there to tell whether it's safe or not. And that's the problem we face and are trying to help people with. And we are doing that on the American side, in Alaska, and training local communities how to monitor what's safe, how to prepare things, what to avoid and when to avoid them. But we wanted to do that across the Bering Strait, but we basically have been stopped there. So I don't have a question for the panel, but just more of a comment that I heard it said that you might want to use the Arctic as an example where cooperation might happen, and this problem with toxic algae is a good example to use because it really does threaten health and food security.
Micless for I accidentally turned my mic off. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dawn. We're really looking at this as the Arctic as a confluence of really important events, as Marisol puts it so nicely. And then the question becomes, is this a place, and Chris raised this right off the bat, is the Arctic a place where you can make the case that there need to be these holes in the Iron Curtain, as Masha said, and what might those holes look like, and what role can science play, both for the sake of science, but also for the sake of relationships and diplomacy on so many topics when those relationships are so important. So I'm now going to open the floor to comments and questions. And again, I just want to remind you that we're working with mics in the ceiling, so nice and loud for the folks online. And I'm going to ask you to be brief so we can get through various questions and comments so that we have time to hear from as many people as possible. So, oh yes, and please, if you can introduce yourself when you speak, that would be great as well. Thanks. And I think I'm good with my hands. Paul, please. Yeah, just accidentally.
My comments are mostly made for students.
Nice and loud, Paul, just for the mics.
My comments are mostly made for the students. Professor Paul Berkeley, a fellow of the International Science Council. In a practical sense, for the Belfer Center and the Davis Center, as well as institutes around me and other places, to contribute. Very good. To help contribute in a practical way, and looking at and listening to the comments that were made, the high seas in particular is an entree point for the international science community to contribute substantively in terms of science diplomacy. I introduced this as the founding director of the Science Diplomacy Center at MGIMO University, Moscow State Institute of International Relations, in 2021. The dialogue with Russia continues with science diplomacy. The challenge is for the science community more largely to be brave, I would say. I felt very lonely in the 4th Arctic Science Ministerial as being the only non-Russian speaker in this handover from Russia to Norway in concert with the chairship of the Arctic Council. There is an opportunity, a real opportunity for science diplomacy to provide leadership and for next generation science diplomats to provide leadership with Russia. The challenge is to think in a way that is completely constructive. And to this end, Jennifer and Belfer Initiative and Davis Center and others, an opportunity is the 5th International Polar Year in 2032, 2033. It's far enough into the future to be uncomplicated by the emotion and the politics of the moment, but it's close enough to build practical lines of communication and interaction. In particular, for the students that are living in Russia, working in Russia, they live in an echo chamber in the absence of dialogue and collaboration from the West. I think, as a science diplomat, longstanding, having convened the first formal dialogue between NATO and Russia regarding security in the Arctic when I was at Cambridge University, that the opportunity is to recognize that the challenges we're trying to face, these planetary boundaries, they have timescales. They have timescales that are beyond the political moment. If we're trying to address climate change, the reality is it's a forever type of challenge. Next generation leaders, those that are young enough in this room, some of you may be alive in the 22nd century. The observations and intuition that you have today, you have to carry with you across the 21st century and provide leadership to future generations. So my comments are practical. Belfer Center wants to create a practical relationship in Russia. MGIMO University is a pathway.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Paul. Other comments or questions from and I know there's some people who have thoughts and opinions on this in the room. I'm not going to call any of you out, but I know you're there, so please. you have a question online? Please.
So this is from Rocky Whites at Tufts University. The question to the panelists is, if you were invited to Mar-a-Lago to brief Trump on opportunities to improve U.S. Russia relations through science diplomacy, what would your top 3 recommendations be?
So Margaret's going to be brave to go
Well,
first.
the first thing that comes to mind is that sea level rise is impacting Florida first and foremost in the United States. What happens when we have another major storm surge and Mar-a-Lago has water lapping at its balconies? I think this is a perfect person to introduce to the concept of sea level rise and how the Arctic is a critical part of that, or dealing with the Arctic, climate change, working across boundaries to solve that problem is one entry point through Mar-a-Lago.
Masha, you want to take it on?
And I hope I'll be there together with you. So we'll just continue because I think, and you frame it, so the key issue is survival of our planet. We're really in crisis. So basically, we have several obstacles on the way, and the war is one of them and horrible. So I think we just should ask him just to stop this and help to stop the war immediately.
With Ukraine's.
With Ukraine, Russia, Ukraine.
Ukraine should set the terms.
Yes, yes.
Marisol, I know you have opinions on this.
Okay, so in terms of, hi Rocky, good to hear from you. So speaking just to the science diplomacy question, I think it's really about understanding that we are living in a fundamentally altered world, and from a U.S. interest perspective, what I was saying before about, for our own economic health and well-being, we need to understand that things are changing, and the more clear-eyed that we can be about challenges to supply chains, about, what are the changes that are occurring in terms of, how we can better manage resources for longevity. I mean, that just makes sense for America and for American people. It's just to not recognize that is to not be realistic about the world that we live in. And I just don't think it behooves us to have a false perception of the reality of the challenges that we're dealing with and what it's going to take to get in front of those challenges to have continued prosperity, because things have to look different. And, we can work together to, facilitate that prosperity, but on our own, it's not, these are transboundary issues and it's going to be much harder.
Great, thank you. I'm going to throw in one more thing. I'm going to take my moderators. I think, and Marisol's touching on it, but she's maybe not being as blunt as I would be. So Rocky, I'm going to take my chance that this is, we need to stop just repeating the same messages, and we need to try and meet people where they're at. I mean, if there's one thing we've learned from the last U.S. election, it's that we haven't been conveying the messages in a way that climate and biodiversity was not an election issue. So what does that mean for how do we communicate differently? And there are two things that really, I think, can resonate with people on a day-to-day basis, and that's health and safety. So what does that mean for American people from a health and safety perspective? What's the connection that can be made there? And for better or for worse, it's economics. What are the economics of this? What does this mean for people's way of life, for their quality of life, and for investment and insurance and all those kind of things that at the end of the day are going to hit people very hard. So that would be my addition to this. Okay, we have a question in the audience. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Jonathan from the School of Design here at Harvard. Hello, Jonathan from the School of Design at Harvard. And I'm doing my thesis on the hamlet of Resolute in the extreme Canadian Arctic. And just talking about this international collaboration, I've just always been oscillating between literature saying how the Northwest Passage should be international and, an international strait, and then Canadian literature saying there's no way, this is absolutely Canadian. So I'm Canadian, so it's difficult not to be biased. And so I just want to see, if it was Canadian, could it help the local communities? If it was international, could it have other advantages? Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this.
Everybody's pointing at me. I'm going to point my husband. Thanks for the question. Yes, this is definitely, one of the interesting things to raise in terms of Arctic and boundaries is the only unresolved boundary in the Arctic is actually between Canada and the U.S. So we can talk about all sorts of things, but at the end of the day, this is a question and it's a sensitivity, and it's through a choice to not resolve it that this has been resolved at this point. The solution has been not to talk about it. Now, there have been more recently some negotiations to try and clarify that, which would presumably also open this question of what the nature of that the passage is in terms of it being international water. But in terms of what that means for responsibility to the people of the Arctic, I would propose to you that the responsibility still lives squarely with the Canadian government to meet the needs and to build the infrastructure that is necessary specifically for the people that live in Resolute and other communities like that. And it is a part of the North American Arctic that has not been well supported by infrastructure. And it is something that deserves attention. And so if, as part of this, we also explore, if the Arctic is a place for cooperation where other cooperation is not possible, how do we ensure that that cooperation is focused on meeting the needs of the communities that live there and prioritizing that? And those are the types of questions I think that people who work in the Arctic need to be prioritizing. Rike, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Rika. I'm a pre-doctoral fellow with the Arctic Initiative. You've all demonstrated the need for data sharing and the need to engage with Russian scientists. So my question is, what are the next practical steps in doing that in a way in which does not endanger Russian scientists?
Sure. Firstly, we've heard already that in Russia, there is a lot of still allowed, right? So sending emails is fine, Zooming is fine, so you can cooperate on this. Also, if you would like to meet, the people can travel out. It'll be difficult, but you hopefully will support them to obtaining visa. Or it's important to get money for this, because basically getting out of Russia, most of the consulates are closed. So, for example, to get American visa, they have to travel to Kazakhstan, Almaty. So you have to plan the trip of this person who you would like to invite somewhere out of Russia, pay this trip and get visa, right? And then invite them to United States or wherever you want. Similar to Schengen. Schengen visas, there are several embassies which are working consulates in Moscow. So you can get visa. Extremely difficult, because even for so it's complicated, but it's possible, and Russians can travel after, if you want. Also, there's still a student exchange. So if you would like to invite somebody to work in the university on short term, it'll be more than welcome. And that is part of science diplomacy, as Professor Brackman said. It's very important to get young people out of Russia, and if you can support, it's possible, but just think that your budget should be higher than it was before, probably three times. I don't know, really have to estimate this. But it's very welcome, Catalin.
Sure, yeah. So I think, so Paul mentioned the International Polar Year, and the planning for that has already started a bit, and I definitely agree that's a great opportunity to be engaging Russian scientists and young researchers. I would definitely follow their lead in terms of what they feel comfortable with, and ways in which they want to engage. Like, they will be the best judge of their own, how just what they feel comfortable with. So I definitely wouldn't push anything. I think it's about kind of figuring out what are those mechanisms for having, just that the people-to-people conversation. So track 2 conversations are really good, where it's, people who aren't a part of the governments to be convening to discuss this and kind of get clarity on how to speak in ways that are, safe. And then there's other, multilateral initiatives. So even through like the IPCC, the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, I think those are also places where you get the international convening of scientists that do include Russians, where we could try to facilitate more data sharing, but also, even through the Arctic Council, there's, so through the working groups, that's still a place where I think we could strengthen data sharing as well.
I would just add that when in June of 2022, the U.S. The Executive Office issued an order which clarified the need for federal agencies to wrap up all science, but it made special exception of clarified that neither universities nor NGOs were subject to the same restrictions. So even though there are complications for Russians to leave Russia, there are things that I think the United States university academia system could open up, bringing in young Russian scientists, supporting supporting Russian young scholars, inviting people to come on field expeditions. Just one of the things that we've heard over and over about what was successful in the previous 30 years was the development of trust and very trust-based relationships. And those times working in the field, working together, makes such a difference in developing long-term relationships. And so we really need a new generation of people who will have those generational relationships.
Great. We have another question online.
This is sort of a synthesis of a couple people asked about this on Zoom, but the possibility of, could you please comment on the possibility of leveraging Russia's relationships with the Arctic Asian observer states in terms of poking holes in this new Iron Curtain?
Council expert. Okay. Do you want to go, Marisol? Oh, you want me? Okay. This has actually been raised many times, and I think there are avenues, and I think there has been some. I'm stealing Marisol's example from earlier, though, which is in the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. We actually saw that exact thing happen, where South Korea hosted an event that enabled the members of that agreement to come together, which included all of the Arctic states as well as others. So I think there is absolutely a role to be played, and that we need to get more creative. So we don't see a lot of those examples. I think that there's more that we can do in that space to ensure that we're triangulating and creating the lines of communication, recognizing that that those types of that the ability to connect and to have the information flow, it should be a priority, and finding multiple ways to do that is important.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with that. I would just add that there is also, we have seen a few instances of self-censorship within the academic community, where even though there actually is the ability to do certain things, there's uncertainty about whether you can do them, and so they're not. And so I think clarifying what is acceptable would be really helpful. And then also in terms of things like, places like, in Japan, for instance, where you can still have a peer-reviewed study that includes Russian researchers. If it's easier to go through the peer review process if they're hosting it, then I think that makes sense for just being able to get get these studies out there, because again, like, you know, the environmental changes that we're seeing are so, things are happening so rapidly that we really need to be, you know, making up for as much time as possible, also because of the very serious data gaps that we have from COVID, right? So this invasion came right after COVID, so we already had data gaps, and so this is really kind of compounding some of those losses that we already had.
Margaret?
Just going back to the Rike's question about what are some practical steps that could be taken. I was remembering a few comments that I've heard actually more than once about the difficulty for Russian authors to be published in Western peer-reviewed journals nowadays. And I don't think there are any explicit it's not an explicit policy, I don't think, of any journal, but it seems that the volume of U.S. Russian co-authored articles has just distinctly decreased since the war. Chinese and Russian co-authored articles have increased in number, and I think that's another just very practical step that these Russian authors should be judged on merit, not on the origin of their country.
Yes, so basically there is no direct restriction doesn't exist for peer review article publication in different journals, but there is a lot of on the level of institutions, on the personal level, on the level of the reviewers who don't want to review if it's from Russia. So that is going on. It's true, and also I've heard the situation when co-authors were telling, oh, sorry, we can't because you are from Russia and my institution just stopped any connection with Russia, so I can't be your co-author. So these things individuals, so they should be overcome, and probably that is with regards to attitude. I can tell, I think it shouldn't be regarded completely like evil. You just think of Russian scientists as in a very difficult situation, probably hijacked. They're not free, they're in danger. There's more and more court cases, especially for the physicists who are just really put in prison. And that is really a dangerous situation for a lot of Russians. And some of the Russians, good scientists, might be pressed for both sides. So they lose their cooperation in the West, they lose the ability to travel to the conference, but as well in Russia, they're in the blacklist, they can be put in prison, and that is going on. So from the humanitarian and personal point of view, I really believe it should be taken in consideration. And please allow me to tell, but there are some of the so-called sanctions on scientists or just they were unnecessary. That doesn't work, and that is not on benefit of United States. I can tell you. So it's just really have to consider and don't be. May I just add a little bit on a personal level?
Please.
I was grown up in Siberia, in a scientific town named Akademgorodok. And that was in 1970, so I was in school there. And there was Americans coming there, and we were sharing our house with a family from Princeton University. He was Black American nuclear physicist with his kids, 4 kids, and we were friends from this time. So I met them recently. But these long-term relations, the trust was built in me, like from my childhood. My parents were biologists, and I'm from the family which goes science roots, to tell the truth, to the beginning of 19th century, the first scientist in the family. So it was just like the scientific tradition in my family goes deep. So I truly believe in the science diplomacy on the personal level. So in 1970s, I was part of my parents' expedition, traveling all over former Soviet Union with 2 American professors and again their kids. We were catching animals. The topic of the research was migrating of the mammals through Beringen Bridge during the different glaciation period, very much connected to this thing. And we are still in touch. They're grown up, they're elderly, so these kids at this time with whom we worked. And I remember we were just doing everything. And I think it's really, really, because scientists speak the same language. Because we remembered like KGB was following us and we jointly were laughing at them. Look who is there, look who is there, like Professor Nadler and Kaufman. So I truly believe that as soon as you find this connection, it's so important. We are not that much different, to tell the truth. I have this feeling.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much, Masha, for sharing that. We have time for one last question or comment, I think. If there's anybody who wants to take, please, Jim.
Thanks very much. I'm Jim Gamble. I'm the Senior Director of Pacific Environment's Arctic Program. And something we haven't really talked directly about, but have alluded to, is the role of Indigenous people in the Arctic and the role of their cooperation and communication. Clearly, Russian Indigenous peoples have been largely cut off now, not just from communication with organizations like the Arctic Council or others, but across borders, talking to colleagues and family. And, you know, the Iron Curtain has kind of come down again in a way. But I think there's also opportunities to support that communication. And it'd be great to hear some thoughts about this special role of Indigenous people in the Arctic.
Anybody? No, come on, you're the panelists.
I'm a little bit hesitant because we.
Yeah, well, I was wondering that too. Would one of our colleagues, Vera, would you like to, please?
I'm Vera Metcalf. I'm probably the only Indigenous person here from Alaska, but born and raised in Savunga on St. Lawrence Island. I live in Nome. And one of the organizations that I was a member of was the Inuit Circumpolar Council. That was a great venue especially for Chukotka, a place for our neighbors across the street to talk business with Canada, Greenland, and Alaska. So that's one venue that could be included. But I also wanted to add that, you know, I work a lot with marine mammal hunters, and one of the issues that we have with receding sea ice conditions is accessibility to marine mammals. Distributions, marine migrations are changing, so often our hunters are encountering poor sea ice conditions and or storm surges. So that poses a safety issue for our hunters. So accessibility is becoming an issue, but hopefully that answered someone's question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vera. I put you on the spot there, so I appreciate it. Oh, please, Marisol.
Yeah, so I think just also making sure that, you know, I guess the current State Department guidance saying that we can have basically use your best discretion at the academic or NGO level, but really making sure that there's not state policy that is hobbling the ability for these Indigenous communities to maintain their familial connections and cultural connections, especially because of the decades where they were separated during the Cold War. So even making sure that the visa-free travel program is accessible, and then also just, you know, from a kind of, you know, the growing combination and trying to kind of bring together the Indigenous knowledge systems with some of the newer knowledge systems of science. You know, we're seeing that if you bring them together, you just get much richer understandings of the challenges that we're dealing with, and you get more comprehensive solutions that really don't just address one of the issues, but you can, through taking that kind of the larger perspectives that so much of the Indigenous knowledge is based out of, you know, so much wisdom that has resulted from evolution of, you know, such a long thousands of years of evolution of coming up with these knowledge systems, you get better answers that address multiple issues. So even for things like wildland fire, that's really important through the Arctic Council. That's one of the initiatives, and bringing back practices like cultural burning, because we, you know, as long as the world has had oxygen, the world has had fire, and we have to learn how to live with it and not try to just suppress it, because that's just leading to much more severe fires, which, you know, we've been seeing all across the Arctic and elsewhere.
Perfect. Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. So thanks, Jim, for bringing that forward, and Vera for talking with us today, focusing on what this means for people who live in communities, and that at the end of the day, that is why we need science diplomacy, is for the health and well-being of the people that live there. So thank you so much for coming to join us, and we hope that we will have future opportunities to continue these conversations with you. So thanks.